When you stop talking, something subtle but powerful happens in the emotional dynamic. Silence doesn't just remove words, it removes certainty. And certainty, especially in modern dating, is one of the most quietly addictive comforts we offer without realizing it. When a man knows exactly where he stands, when he knows you'll explain, reassure, follow up, or smooth things over, his nervous system relaxes. He may still care, but he no longer has to engage. Silence interrupts that ease. Most people believe attraction is built through communication alone, but psychologically, attraction is sustained through emotional tension, not drama, not games, tension created by unpredictability and presence. When you go silent, you're not trying to provoke anxiety. You're allowing space for awareness. In that space, the mind fills in the gaps. And what fills those gaps isn't logic, it's feeling. Suddenly, he notices your absence in ways he never noticed your words. There's a philosophical truth here worth sitting with. We don't value what is constantly available. We value what requires attention. When communication is constant, it becomes background noise to the emotional system. Silence, however, acts like a pause in music. It makes the listener lean in. It forces the question, what just changed? And once that question is asked, attention returns. This is why over-explaining rarely creates closeness. Explanation offers comfort, but comfort dulls curiosity. Silence removes the explanation and leaves curiosity intact. And curiosity is one of the strongest emotional motivators there is. When you stop narrating your feelings, your intentions, or your pain, you invite the other person to feel instead of analyze. He has to sit with the absence of your emotional presence. And that absence disrupts the story he was telling himself. What's important here is intention. Silence isn't withdrawal as punishment. It's not a strategy to make someone chase. It's a boundary that says, I will not fill space where my value is being taken for granted. That distinction matters deeply because when silence comes from self-respect rather than manipulation, it carries weight. It feels different. It's grounded, not reactive. Men often don't miss you when you're talking because talking can keep the relationship emotionally regulated. Silence, on the other hand, destabilizes emotional certainty. And when certainty disappears, the emotional system wakes up. He starts replaying conversations, questioning assumptions, noticing what he no longer has access to. Not because you demanded attention, but because attention was no longer guaranteed. This is where power quietly shifts. Not power over someone, but power within yourself. You're no longer trying to be understood. You're allowing yourself to be felt. And that is far more impactful. Silence invites emotional responsibility. It says, without words, if you want access to me, you must meet me with intention. So remember this. Silence isn't absence, it's presence redirected inward. And when you choose silence from a place of self-worth, you don't disappear from his mind. You become impossible to ignore. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in attraction is this idea that being more available, more communicative, more expressive will naturally make someone value us more. Intuitively, it feels right. After all, closeness should create closeness. But psychologically, that's not how desire deepens. What actually reveals a man's emotional investment is not how he behaves when everything is easy and familiar, but how he responds when access to you is no longer automatic. When you stop filling every gap with words, you remove the emotional scaffolding he may have been leaning on without realizing it. Many men don't consciously choose complacency, they drift into it. Consistent communication can quietly train someone to believe the connection is stable regardless of effort. Silence interrupts that training. It introduces a moment of reckoning where intention has to replace habit. Here's the key distinction. Silence doesn't create feelings that weren't already there. It reveals them. When you go quiet, a man is forced to confront a simple internal question. Do I care enough to step forward? Or am I comfortable letting this fade? Talking endlessly can delay that question for months, even years. Silence asks it immediately. From a psychological standpoint, this works because humans are loss averse. We are far more motivated by the potential loss of something meaningful than by the steady presence of it. When you're always explaining, accommodating, and keeping the emotional thread alive, there is no perceived risk. Silence introduces risk, not artificially, but honestly, and risk is where truth lives. Philosophically, this is about responsibility. When you stop speaking, you stop managing the emotional connection for both of you. You hand responsibility back to him. And what he does with that responsibility tells you everything you need to know. Does he lean in with clarity and effort, or does he retreat into passivity and confusion? Neither outcome is a failure. Both are information. This is why silence can feel uncomfortable, but also deeply empowering. You're no longer trying to convince someone of your worth through presence. You're allowing your absence to clarify whether your presence was valued in the first place. That shift from persuasion to observation is where emotional maturity lives. It's also important to understand that. Silence doesn't mean emotional coldness. It means emotional containment. You're choosing not to leak your energy into a dynamic that isn't meeting you fully. That choice sends a subtle but powerful signal. I don't chase connection, I respond to it. And that signal is felt, even if it's never consciously articulated. Men who are emotionally invested don't disappear in the face of silence. They get clearer. They become intentional. They ask better questions. Men who are only enjoying the convenience of your emotional availability tend to fade. Again, this isn't punishment, it's alignment. So if there's one thing to take with you here, let it be this. Silence doesn't end connections that are real. It exposes connections that were incomplete. And the moment you stop talking to keep something alive is often the moment you discover what was truly alive to begin with. There's a deeper layer to silence that often gets missed, and it has nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with identity. When you stop talking, you're not just changing the dynamic between you and him, you're redefining the relationship you have with yourself. This is where silence stops being a tactic and starts becoming a boundary. Psychologically, people take their cues from how we treat our own time, energy, and emotional attention. When you over-communicate, over-explain, or constantly seek resolution, the unspoken message is that access to you is unlimited and unconditional. Not because you aren't valuable, but because you're behaving as if your value needs to be justified through effort. Silence reverses that message. It says, without drama or confrontation, my presence is not automatic. It's earned through mutual engagement. What's powerful here is that this isn't about withdrawal as punishment. It's about self-respect as a standard. When you go silent, you're no longer negotiating your worth in real time. You're no longer asking, is this enough? You're quietly deciding, is this aligned? And that internal shift changes everything. From a philosophical perspective, this is the move from attachment to sovereignty. Attachment says, I need this connection to feel whole. Sovereignty says, I choose connection from a place of wholeness. Silence naturally emerges from the second state because you're no longer afraid of space. You trust that what's real will survive it. This is why silence often makes men reassess. Not because they're being manipulated, but because something familiar has changed. The emotional economy is different. You're no longer over-functioning to keep things smooth. You're no longer absorbing uncertainty on his behalf. And suddenly, he has to meet you at your level or recognize that he can't. There's also an important internal benefit here. Silence gives you back your clarity. When you stop reacting, you start observing. You notice how often you were the one initiating, repairing, reassuring. You notice how much emotional labor you were carrying quietly. And with that awareness comes discernment. You stop asking, how do I make this work? And start asking, should this work at all? Men are deeply responsive to this shift, even if they can't name it. A woman who is grounded in herself, who doesn't rush to fill silence, who doesn't panic when communication pauses, this signals emotional maturity and self-trust. It communicates that you are not governed by fear of loss, and confidence rooted in self-trust is far more compelling than confidence performed for approval. Of course, this kind of silence requires courage. It asks you to tolerate uncertainty. It asks you to sit with the discomfort of not knowing how he'll respond. But that discomfort is temporary. The clarity that follows is lasting. And here's the truth most people avoid. If someone pulls away when you stop overgiving, they weren't responding to you. They were responding to what you provided. Silence reveals that distinction cleanly and without cruelty. So let silence do its real work. Let it restore your center. Let it recalibrate the dynamic. Let it show you who steps forward when you stop carrying the connection alone. Because the moment you choose self-respect over self-explanation is the moment your relationships start telling the truth. One of the most misunderstood aspects of silence is what it forces the other person to confront. When you stop filling the space, you don't just disappear, you create a mirror. And in that mirror, a man comes face to face with his own level of investment. While conversation can distract, entertain, or soothe, silence strips things back to the essential question, how much do I actually want this? Psychologically, people don't fully value something until they have to supply effort to keep it. When you are always present, always responsive, always available to talk things through, there is no urgency for him to step up emotionally. Silence interrupts that pattern. It introduces a moment where he must choose, reach forward or drift away. And that choice is incredibly revealing, both to him and to you. What's important here is that silence activates intrinsic motivation. When someone moves toward you in silence, it's not because they were coaxed or convinced. It's because desire pulled them forward. That's why the connection that survives silence is always stronger. It's rooted in volition, not convenience. There's also a subtle but powerful recalibration of power that happens. Power in relationships isn't about control. It's about agency. When you stop chasing clarity through words, you reclaim agency over your emotional world. You're no longer dependent on his responses to feel settled. That self-containment is deeply attractive because it signals emotional stability. It says, I can hold myself even when things are uncertain. From a philosophical standpoint, silence is where authenticity lives. Words can be performative, silence cannot. In the quiet, people reveal who they are through action. Does he check in? Does he reflect? Does he take responsibility for the distance? Or does he remain passive, waiting for you to resume carrying the connection? Silence doesn't judge. It simply exposes. This is also where many women make a critical shift in self-perception. Instead of seeing silence as loss, they begin to experience it as space to breathe, to think, to feel their own desires again. You stop measuring your worth by the frequency of his messages and start measuring alignment by consistency of effort. That change alone transforms how you show up, regardless of what he does next. It's worth saying clearly, silence is not about testing or teaching someone a lesson. When used that way, it becomes manipulative and draining. The kind of silence that changes everything is grounded in self-respect. It's the silence that arises naturally when you decide not to chase what isn't meeting you halfway. And here's the paradox. When you stop trying to secure the relationship, you often create the conditions for a real one to form. Because now, if he comes closer, it's because he wants to, not because you made it easy to stay without effort. So let silence do its work without anxiety. Let it separate interest from habit, intention from inertia. Because the quiet you allow today becomes the clarity that protects you tomorrow. And the man who steps forward in that quiet is the only one worth meeting there. There is a moment in every relationship where clarity arrives, not through answers, but through restraint. It's the moment when you realize that constantly explaining yourself, justifying your feelings, or trying to be understood is quietly teaching the other person that your needs are negotiable. Silence at this stage becomes an act of self-definition, not withdrawal, not punishment, definition. Psychologically, people tend to respect boundaries they did not have to negotiate down. When you stop over-explaining, you communicate a powerful, unspoken message. I know what I deserve, and I don't need to argue for it. This is where attraction deepens, not because silence creates mystery, but because it restores dignity. A man may forget words spoken in emotional moments, but he does not forget the moment a woman stopped trying to convince him of her value. Silence also interrupts the dynamic of emotional labor imbalance. In many connections, one person becomes the emotional engine, processing, initiating, repairing, and soothing, while the other passively benefits. When you go silent, that engine stops running. Suddenly, the relationship either stalls or the other person steps in to power it. That shift is deeply confronting. It forces a man to ask himself whether he wants to be a participant or merely a passenger. This is where memory is formed. People don't remember ease. They remember moments of reckoning. Silence becomes a psychological marker because it's unusual. It breaks pattern. And the human brain is wired to remember disruptions more vividly than routines. When you stop speaking where you once did, your absence in that space becomes louder than any argument ever was. From a philosophical perspective, silence is where self-respect becomes visible. Respect is not something we demand, it's something others infer from how we treat ourselves. When you refuse to chase, over-clarify, or emotionally overextend, you model the kind of regard you expect. That modeling doesn't just change how others see you, it changes how you see yourself. There's also an internal shift that happens in this silence. You begin to notice, you were abandoning your own peace just to keep the connection alive. Without the noise, you can finally hear your intuition again. You feel where things are aligned and where they are not. And once you reconnect with that inner clarity, you become far less willing to trade authenticity for attention. What's important to understand is that this silence is not cold. It's calm. It's the quiet confidence of someone who trusts that what is meant for them will meet them without persuasion. And paradoxically, that calm is deeply compelling. It invites the other person to rise, not because they're pushed, but because the standard is quietly set. If a man responds to this silence by leaning in, it's because he senses something real is at stake. And if he doesn't, the silence has still done its job. It has protected you from investing further in something that required you to shrink to sustain it. So let silence be your alignment check. Not a tactic, not a test, but a declaration. Because the woman who stops explaining herself doesn't disappear. She becomes unforgettable. There comes a point where silence stops being a phase and starts becoming a turning point. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because something settled inside you. You no longer feel the impulse to chase clarity, reassurance, or validation from someone who hasn't shown the capacity to meet you there. And that inner shift is the most powerful part of all. Because once it happens, you don't go back. Psychologically, this is the moment identity replaces hope. Early on, many people stay connected to relationships through anticipation. Maybe it will change. Maybe he'll realize. Maybe if I explain one more time. Silence marks the end of that mental loop. It's the moment you stop organizing your behavior around potential and start organizing it around reality. That alone rewires how you experience. E, attachment. You're no longer waiting to be chosen. You're choosing alignment. This is also where attraction either deepens or dissolves, but in a healthy way. When a woman becomes grounded in her own self-worth, she stops radiating need and starts radiating presence. Presence is attractive because it's calm, centered, and unforced. A man who is emotionally available will feel drawn toward that energy. A man who isn't will often pull away. And that divergence isn't loss, it's sorting. From a philosophical lens, silence here becomes an act of authorship. You are no longer reacting to the story, you're writing the next chapter. Instead of asking, what does he want? You begin asking, what kind of relationship do I want to live inside of? That question changes everything because it shifts your focus from approval to design. What many people don't realize is that this kind of silence creates memory not just in others, but in yourself. You remember the moment you chose peace over pursuit. You remember the relief of not overthinking every message, not replaying every conversation, and that memory becomes a reference point. Once you know how that freedom feels, it becomes very difficult to accept anything that costs you your self-respect. If a man comes back after this silence, he often does so differently, not louder, but clearer, because the silence made him confront the absence of your emotional availability. And absence, when it's clean and dignified, has a way of clarifying desire. But here's the crucial distinction. You no longer need that return to feel complete. You can meet it with discernment instead of longing. And if he doesn't come back, the silence still resolves the story. It ends ambiguity without drama. It closes the loop without bitterness. You walk forward, knowing you didn't abandon yourself to keep someone else comfortable. This is why the woman who goes silent is never forgotten, not because she vanished, but because she chose herself without hostility. That choice leaves a lasting imprint. It signals emotional maturity, self-trust, and depth, qualities that linger in memory long after conversations fade. So let silence be your conclusion, not your punishment. Let it be the moment you stop waiting and start becoming. Because when you choose yourself in the quiet, you don't just change the relationship, you change the standard by which every future relationship is measured.